A while ago, I did a video on a series called Galaxy Grudge Match. It's a series on the Galaxy video channel that I really like. I'd highly recommend checking out if you haven't seen it already, but it's not the only versus show they do. While Galaxy Grudge Match is more focused on scenarios, they have another versus show called Multiverse Match, which is more your traditional style versus debating. And with season 1 recently wrapping up, I'm going to cover all the episodes in it and see what I think of them in retrospect. If you've seen the Galaxy Grudge Match review, you know how this is going to work. No need for a super long intro, let's just get into it. Inspector Gadget vs Robocop was the first thing I ever saw from the Galaxy video channel, so in a way it's the only reason I know Max and Ducko that well at all. So I can appreciate it for that at least. But outside of that, I don't have much to say on the episode. Covers the characters well, but nothing sticks out in the analysis as particularly amazing or particularly bad. Except when Ducko makes a joke about Gadget being able to stretch his dick, no thank you. The fight scene is super low energy, but it seems like it kinda fits Robocop, I don't know. Ducko voiced both characters decently well. I like the shot of Robocop throwing the car, and that's all I really have to say here. It's an okay first episode that doesn't really compare to the later ones. Well, all except for... Parappa vs Ulala is the only real episode of the season I'd say doesn't work for me at all, but at least they got it out of the way quickly. The analysis is mostly good, though there are a few jokes that are kinda unfunny, and a lot of the jokes are just, we reference this thing. That's it, that's the joke, please laugh. But we did get Ducko shouting, "You said that already!" and Max shouting, "Keep it in your pants, Parappa, you're on the road!" So that balances out, I guess. As for the fight, I mean, Max did the best he could with his limited resources, but it was still kinda boring. Parappa's repetitive voice clips also got really annoying, and I didn't like any of the dialogue. Still, when there's only one episode of the whole season I don't like, which is one of the earliest episodes that isn't even that bad, that's a good sign for the future. Jaws vs Ecco is a 10 out of 10 by default because it includes a clip of the absolutely goated Bruce the Shark. Love that guy. But unironically, this is a pretty good episode. Max did surprisingly well with the very limited sprites he had to work with. Ecco's speed is conveyed better than movie Sonic's despite coming out several months earlier, and I don't know how to feel about that. The death is creative. I'm impressed with how they managed to make the analysis segment as long as they did, albeit the Ecco origin segment does drag a bit. And I love the recurring use of Under the Sea as background music. I don't have a whole lot to say on this one, it's just a really solid episode that I really like. Also, why does Jaws' end clip not even have him in it? That's a bit weird. Marty vs Dipper had to be taken down originally for copyright issues, but also Max wanted to change some other things about it as well. Though I can't remember what those things were, so maybe I liked the episode even more because of it, who knows. This episode is probably my favourite in regards to the characters it uses. Gravity Falls is one of my favourite shows ever, and the episode got me to check out Back to the Future, which turned out to be my favourite film trilogy ever, so that was nice. The analysis covers the characters well, and the benefit of using these characters means they get to use songs from both of their series, and they both have amazing soundtracks. The instrumentals for Earth Angel, Taking Over Midnight, and both series' main themes are incredible, and they make the analysis all the more rewatchable for me. The animation's really good too. I didn't like the setup at first, but after seeing Back to the Future 3 and remembering the multi-bear episode of Gravity Falls, it made more sense to me, so I think it works. The fight manages to use a good amount of both of their weapons, and there's some really fast-paced scenes. Some parts look a little wonky, mainly whenever either of them are meant to be holding something, but for the most part it's pretty well done. Winston the Skeleton and the Lucky Derp did well voicing both Marty and Dipper respectively, though there were a few line deliveries that didn't quite sell it for me, but those were few and far between. My biggest complaint with the episode is that they didn't work in Bill's Cipher and the Galaxy Initiative, which they didn't even know what to do with at this point. Come on, the opportunity was right there. Darkwing vs Goliath is good, and that's all I have to say about it really. The animation's fun, but it's super short. Goliath's last line is kinda cringe, but I do really like the death. It was pretty creative. The analysis covers both of them pretty well. Max and Ducko do a really good job going over all the facts. Maybe a little too well though. There are some numbers that they bring up for some calcs that they feel the need to say in their entirety, and it just doesn't feel necessary. They could have said the final output was just under 38 quadrillion joules and showed the actual number on screen, but they spend a full 10 seconds reading out the number. And this happens twice in the calc. Ducko also has some jokes in the analysis that are just, Since then, he has been the terror that faps in the night. Or flaps in the night, sorry. This is a multi-purpose gas gun, which can make evildoers suck ass. Or gas. Yeah, that's all I have to say here. Moving on. Freddy Krueger vs Pennywise might be the episode I've rewatched the most, assuming Donald vs Daffy hasn't caught up by the time this video comes out. It's rare to see versus shows tackle horror films, so I'm really glad to see that one of the first that I've seen is ran by someone with a passion for the horror genre, and it really shines through in the episode. The analysis covers both quite well, and I'm glad that they still showed Freddy the respect that he deserves, in spite of the fact that he loses by magnitudes that we can't even perceive. They even say that he has advantages over Pennywise in spite of the stat gap. That's a hint for later. I'm really glad that they opted to use Dreamworld Freddy instead of just having Real World Freddy fight a Pennywise avatar. It leads to a lot more creative potential in the animation, which I feel is capitalized on. Freddy uses a good amount of his powers, from regeneration, teleportation, cloning, and even size changing to allow for a kaiju fight. Not what I was expecting from this match of all things, but I'm glad we got it. And Pennywise even uses Freddy's main fear against him, that was neat. I also really enjoyed the banter between the characters. Freddy's cockiness and need to come up with jokes for every single situation he's in led to some really funny exchanges. And Pennywise gets some great closing remarks before he puts Freddy down, sold really well by the voice performance from About Midnight. In the way of negatives, there are a few bits of the animation that just don't look quite right. Pennywise straight up doesn't move at all when the Freddy clones are attacking him all at once. And Freddy using the gauntlet looks, yikes. He puts it on the wrong hand, and then it cuts from sprites to hyper-realistic Pennywise.png, and I find that way funnier than I'm probably supposed to. The episode also pulls a Thanos vs Darkseid and makes the winner beyond obvious for a good while before they actually land the killing blow, but this episode handles it way better, so I don't have nearly as much of an issue with it here as I did with the death battle. The live-action video game movie Royale was my pick for my favourite Multiverse match to include back in my top 15 favourite versus episodes last year, and while I don't love it quite as much as I did back then, evident by how I have now scored it lower than Freddy vs Pennywise, this episode is still pretty great. The biggest positive is Voice for Hire's performance as Movie Sonic. They did a pretty much perfect job, and this is easily the best voice performance of any episode I've covered so far. Sonic is the highlight of the fight in general. His time-slowing segments are super fun. The van getting launched looks a bit weird, but oh well. It's weird that I'm calling Sonic the highlight when that's usually my least favourite series in Versus, but that's specifically Game Sonic. The movie version isn't nearly as much of a headache. He wasn't the only thing I liked about the fight though. The eventual Mario and Sonic team up to take down Pac-Man was neat, and I love how Mario's devolution gun was used on Detective Pikachu. Also, he kicks him in the head, and I found it way funnier than I think was intended. Another aspect of the episode I love was something I usually don't take notice of in Versus episodes, and that's the music and the analysis. I think Death Battle straying away from copyrighted songs has made me forget just how well they can add to the rewatch value of an analysis for me, and this episode has some really great ones. It has some of my favourite songs like Don't Stop Me Now and Holding Out for a Hero, and other great ones like Working for the Weekend and Gangster's Paradise. So while I don't love the episode quite as much as I did last year, I still love it a lot. If you like longer Versus episodes, this is the one for you. Check it out, it's really fun. The Fonz vs Steve Urkel is the prime example of the kind of out-of-the-box matches I really enjoy seeing on this show. Multiverse Match quite frequently tackles series I'd never expect anyone else to use, and even lesser used characters in series that are already somewhat popular in Versus. Fonz vs Urkel has dialogue that feels right at home in a sitcom, a setup that fits the characters perfectly, and a really nice ending. Max was able to make surprisingly good use of what both had to make for a really creatively choreographed fight. And I like the finisher. The analysis is really good too. I'm surprised how long they were able to make this episode of all things. The only big complaint I have with it is that the Fonz's laser dodging feat isn't really covered very well. Having relativistic reaction speeds would be a massive deal against Urkel, but it's kind of brushed off as if it doesn't matter all that much. And they don't call it an outlier like the previously mentioned mountain level feat that the Fonz had. The fight has a few minor issues here and there as well. A few of Urkel's gadgets do kind of feel like they get disposed of way too quickly, and I'm not exactly sure what was up with the Sonic transformation. If that was meant to be his super speed juice or whatever, then it's not conveyed really well since Urkel never really gets to use his super speed, so that just felt like a bit of wasted potential. Still, my issues with this episode are mostly minor. It's still a really good episode, and I look forward to seeing more unique matchups like this in the future. You know, if you're looking for more sitcoms to use, I actually know this one by Disney that came out in 2013, and boy does it have a match I like attached to it. Knives vs Sakura is one of the lower points of this show for sure. Let's start with the positives. Brandon and Max did really good with the editing. The characters were covered fairly well in the analysis, and the animation quality was pretty good. All things I can sum up pretty quickly, but this episode has a lot holding it back from me being able to call it really good. While the fight is well animated, it's less than a minute long and hardly anything happens in it. What's worse is that there's no voice acting, so the characters don't get to have any banter to help the fight stand out at all, which is especially disappointing given that Scott Pilgrim is a series with a lot of great jokes, and I wish that got to be reflected in the episode. The conclusion also doesn't feel like it gives Knives that much respect, basically saying that Sakura wipes the floor with her, even giving her the benefit of the doubt. I'm not expecting them to treat it like a close match when it really isn't, but this is far from the stompiest match they've done. Freddy vs Pennywise was much more unfair, but Freddy still felt like he put up more of a fight. Knives actually does have some pretty huge advantages, namely her speed, but it feels brushed aside as if it doesn't matter at all. Don't get me wrong, this isn't really a bad episode per se, but I can't really say it's good either. It's just kind of average, and that's about all I have to say about it. Oh wait, no, they say Ryu's name like 10 times in the episode, and they hype him up. Never mind, this one's my favourite now. Wreck-It Ralph vs Captain N is probably one of the funnier episodes of the show, partially because it feels like there are more attempts at jokes than in most other episodes, and partially because they bully Ralph flosses on the internet, which is always appreciated. The funniest part, and I have no clue if this was intentional, is the clip they play over
"Meanwhile, if Ralph were to get his hands on Kevin..."
It fits way too perfectly. The fight is good too. I'm unsure on how I feel about the part of the fight where they travel between different games. On one hand, it allows for a bunch of different set pieces and some fun references. On the other hand, some of them do kind of feel like they mess with the pacing of the fight a bit. Captain N's running also feels weird. It feels super slow, and I don't think it fit the shot of him running away from the explosion at all. The setup also confused me a bit at first, since we don't really get a good view of the laser being shot at Ralph. It kind of looks like he's just jumping over nothing. None of those negatives are deal breakers though. Max still makes good use of the evidently limited sprites he had to work with. The fight is pretty fun, and I really loved the finisher. Max's voices for Ralph and Sully are very similar to the point where I half expected him to scream "Over the line!" at some point. Mad Max Grabelski vs Henry Evans is pretty much the shining example of how Multiverse match is far more interesting in terms of the matches it'll do compared to any other versus show. Sure, you have your big comic, anime and cartoon rivalries here and there, but what other show's going to use live action movie characters as obscure as these? One of them doesn't even have superhuman stats. I almost never see versus shows using characters like that. That unfortunately does make the who would win aspect less interesting, but this is still the kind of creative matchup you likely won't find anywhere else. I'll get the negatives out of the way first. For some reason, Henry starts the battle by leaving his crossbow on the ground and running away, but not to worry, he just magically has it again later, somehow. I'm not exactly sure what's meant to be happening at the end here. Is this Henry headbutting Max to make him let go? That would make sense, but it all happens so fast and doesn't give you time to process that. Max also gets over the kid's death surprisingly quickly, as he's already back up on the cliffside in the very next shot. And I don't really care for his last line. They could have gone for a really comedic or somber line from him that would have fit with one of their respective movies, but they just don't really do that. Okay, I'm done complaining now because everything else about this fight is great. The slapsticky action, the fun banter, the death, pretty much all of it works. It even has possibly the best hand-drawn stuff of the season, which I really was not expecting. Henry's most notable lines from the film are used in ways that feel natural and not just shoved in for reference's sake. They even somehow incorporate Mr. Highway into the fight in a fun way. In terms of the analysis segments, the characters are both covered very well, and I'm shocked that they were able to make a decently long analysis for Henry fucking Evans despite him having like a singular feat that isn't even superhuman. If they can make one for him, they can make one for pretty much anyone. Although admittedly Henry's lack of material does lead to some stuff being repeated a bit. I'm also very glad they didn't run the Max shares a name with one of the hosts gag into the ground. They did it once, it was funny, and they left it at that. They didn't have Grabelski's entire analysis revolve around it. Again, the result was beyond obvious, but I'm glad they actually elaborated and didn't just end it with Grabelski is stronger and has a gun, GG. Lupin III vs Kaitou Kid is my favourite matchup on this entire season list, and it held the title of my favourite episode for a good few months. It's been bumped down to second place now, but don't let that distract from how good it is. The animation is great, the setup builds on the official crossover, they use both characters' gadgets effectively, the voice acting is good on both ends, the jokes land, and the ending is really cool. There's even some really good hand-drawn stuff. Ribbit's art style fits Kaitou perfectly, though I will say his hand in this shot looks oddly small next to his head. It's the analysis that sticks out most to me though. You can tell this was a labour of love on Ribbit's end, and both Max and Ducko were still very clearly passionate about it despite being out of their usual comfort zone. They cover both characters' wide histories really well, and given that they were both practically even in stats, it makes the conclusion even more interesting. It's the closest multiverse match by far, and the conclusion they came to genuinely caught me off guard. If only I hadn't been spoiled beforehand, but oh well. Also, props to Ducko for being the only one of the 3 people to work on the episode that was betting on the correct verdict from the start. If I am to bring up the one thing about the analysis that bothered me though, they only gave a calc for Lupin while putting Kid at vaguely building level. I think they either should have had numbers for both of them or just put them both at vaguely building level. Having specific numbers for just one of them doesn't feel right when the match is this close. Still, I have very few big issues with this episode. It made one of my dream matches into a reality, and I'm really happy that it turned out so well. Fun fact, this originally started out as an episode of Free For All, which honestly just feels like such a non-branded match to do that I find it really hard to imagine now. Then again, it also seems like such a non-Max and Ducko episode, so the fact that it happened on either show and not fictional fisticuffs is just so bizarre to me. But that does mean that the Lupin slot on fictional fisticuffs is still open, so maybe this is how I convince Ribbit to do Jigen vs McCree, or Lupin vs Sly, or All For One versus the Like Yagami vs Herbert West is really great. Max has previously said that his animations are better at storytelling than with combat, and this episode shows just how good he can get at that. The action is good, though brought down by how awfully the styles of the sprites clash, but the story is where the fight excels. From the setup that fits both perfectly to the legitimately chilling way Light is able to initially take Herbert down with the Death Note, it's all so good. Elevated by the amazing voice cast. Jeffersaurus, Ducko, and Scott J. Zim do great as Light, Herbert, and Ryuk respectively. The episode has a really great analysis portion too. It's really long and in-depth, and since neither has much to go over in the way of stats, they get to actually dive into the stories and arsenal they both have. There are even some good jokes thrown in. They bully the Netflix Death Note, which is definitely welcomed. Ducko references something with his idol in it, and they reference some really based rap battle that I've totally seen. My biggest issue is how they never even address Herbert West's solar system level feats, but I get they wanted to at least make it seem close, so I'll let it slide this time. The Christmas comedy battle royale is good, and that's about all I have to say with it. The animation's good for the most part, I like how Jack Frost's death was handled, but the way the others went down wasn't quite as creative. Buddy hits Santa 8 times the exact same way, and then takes Turbo Man out by hitting him the exact same way. I think my biggest issue with the episode is the lack of voice acting, for the same reason as Knives vs Sakura, though this episode is hindered by it much more. The episode with comedy in the name has no banter. Yeah, Buddy gets that one line at the start, but after that no one really interacts with anyone else. The animation's also pretty short, which didn't give it too many opportunities to leave much of an impression on me. I understand why given the time Max had to work on it, but it's still unfortunate. Still, it's a fun episode, I enjoyed it. Now onto what I really want to talk about. Donald vs. Daffy may be one of the greatest versus show finales I've ever seen. An issue that even Death Battle faces outside of Goku vs. Superman is that no matter how good their finales are, they could all be swapped around with a different episode in their season and it wouldn't feel noticeably different. Donald vs. Daffy is not an example of this. You couldn't swap this with Kid vs. Lupin or Freddy vs. Pennywise and have it fit into place. This feels like a big event for the channel, first made obvious by the insanely long video length that shows just how deep Max and Ducko dived into the material for both to cover absolutely everything. The analysis covers both characters so well, and not just in terms of stats and abilities, but it covers their personalities really well too. And instead of ending on a note about how one character is clearly always going to be better than the other, they have a nice moment where they reflect on the characters' legacies and what makes them so special. And We Are the Champions playing in the background makes the moment feel even more impactful. Then there's the fight, the first one to be animated by someone other than Max himself, and Larry chose a fine time to peak with this one. This animation is so good. The cartoony action, the constant back and forth that somehow manages to include most of the characters' arsenals, creative uses of abilities and great jokes all contribute to what is easily the best fight scene of this entire series, and easily Larry's own personal best. They even managed to have a really tense beam struggle and a great fake out that, despite me already being told the result beforehand, actually fooled me for a second into thinking that they changed the winner at the last second. I think what really helps sell the fight is Daffy's voice acting though. Voice for Hire returns after previously giving us the best voice performance of the season up until that point, and decided,
I'll fucking do it again.
Their Daffy impression is practically perfect. They sell every line so well, and I can't wait to see them return for another episode in the future. Is the episode perfect? No. This episode has both the best and worst voice performances of the season, ironically enough. While Voice for Hire killed it as Daffy, Super CJ as Donald didn't do quite as well. A lot of their deliveries sounded kinda low energy, there are points where they just flat out don't match with the subtitles, and they're just generally impossible to understand without the subtitles. I know Donald is supposed to be difficult to understand, but this is taking it more than a step too far. As for other minor issues, this also falls into the same issue as Kid vs Lupin, where Donald is given a direct number for his speed, but Daffy is just given a vague tier with no frame of reference as to how much faster Donald actually is. That's about all I didn't like though. The flaws in this episode don't matter much in the long run for me. It might fall ever so short of getting that 10 out of 10 score, but I can't oversell just how close it got and how amazing it is. It's an endlessly rewatchable, incredibly fun episode that serves as an excellent love letter for two of the most iconic characters in all of fiction. Even if you've seen earlier Multiverse matches and disliked them, I still highly recommend checking Donald vs Daffy out. Few modern versus shows have the amount of passion poured into them that this episode does. So that was season 1 of Multiverse Match. What did I think? Well, given the positive scores I gave most of the episodes, it goes without saying that I really enjoyed the season overall. But the big question is whether or not I preferred these over the first 15 episodes of Galaxy Grudge Match. Not really. But I think that just comes down to the fundamental differences in the shows. Multiverse Match is far more thoroughly researched and presents the characters' abilities and stats in a far better way. If that's the aspect of Versus you care the most about, then I don't doubt that you'll most likely prefer Multiverse Match. The better storytelling bits in Multiverse Match are also better than those in the Galaxy Grudge Match scenarios, for the most part. Going back to when Max said his animations excelled with stories over action, I really agreed with him. Episodes like Light vs Herbert, Freddy vs Pennywise, and Donald vs Daffy, which he didn't animate but still wrote, are prime examples of that. And there's no abysmal failure on Multiverse Match that serves as their equivalent of the Stretch Royale. But for me, I find the scenario-based format of Galaxy Grudge Match far more interesting. Plus, it's way funnier, so more moments tend to stick with me. Not to say that Multiverse Match was unfunny, because outside of Parappa vs Ulala, I struggle to think of any jokes that I found particularly bad, but there are noticeably fewer attempts at comedy than with Galaxy Grudge Match, since that show has to be entirely carried by the dialogue between the debaters. At the end of the day though, which show is better really doesn't matter. They're both labours of love by everyone involved for each series they use. They're two really well made shows, and I look forward to seeing the directions they both go with their upcoming episodes. Anyway, that about wraps all this up. If you care how I rank these episodes, then I'll put that on screen, and go watch Multiverse Match if you haven't. It's really good. I'm really tired, this took a lot out of me, thanks for watching.